They have this desire to get out of Europe, and they don't seem to have given very much thought at all to the practicalities, the consequences, or the costs, or indeed to the equally fundamental question, what should actually come next in terms of the longer term relationship between the EU and the UK. And yet leaving the EU was always going to be the relatively easy part. And having made that decision, the much more difficult question facing the UK was always going to be, how should the country now reorientate itself on the world stage? And in that regard, even if the Leave campaign itself never properly defined a clear and coherent vision for the future, the basic choice facing the UK was and remains relatively simple. There are two main options. Option one, the UK could aim for a relatively close future relationship with the EU. Now, that would have the benefits, of course, of minimizing disruption in fields like trade and security. It would also make the Irish border problem much less difficult to manage as part of a UK-wide settlement, but it would inevitably come at the price of the UK aligning itself to European regulatory standards without exercising any appreciable degree of influence over their formulation. As Evelyn said, voluntarily giving up our voice at the table. Option two, the UK could instead settle for a relatively distant future relationship with the EU. Now, that might appear to tally with the political slogan of taking back control, but conversely, of course, it would come at the cost of much greater dislocation in fields like trade and security, and it would also increase the pressure to address the Irish border problem by treating Northern Ireland very differently from the rest of the UK, the segregation of the country that Theresa May warned about repeatedly. But in addition, of course, this option two, this prospect of a serious split between the EU and the UK, really begged the question about what the purpose of this freedom of manoeuvre should be. And in particular, the hard right of the Leave campaign have long dreamt, as we know, of departing from what they regard as the hated economic and social model espoused by European democracies. But what do they want to replace it with? That's the key question that we're still waiting for an answer. Is it going to be an enthusiastic push for closer alignment to an alternative policy, an alternative set of approaches, for example, championed by the US? Are they going to cling to some optimistically rosy world in which global Britain will act as its own independent reference point for regulation, trade and security? Or is it all going to end in a rather more bleak future in which a relatively isolated, mid-ranking power has to steer a delicate diplomatic course between the world's existing and emergent superpowers and regional power blocs? So the basic dilemma facing the UK was pretty stark, pretty obvious. Will it be option one or option two? And if it's option two, how do you answer those fundamental questions about the future? The problem is that the very survival of Theresa May's government depended upon avoiding those problems, pretending they didn't exist, and pretending that we didn't have to make any such choices at all. Now, soon after coming to power, Theresa May, with virtually no public or parliamentary debate or scrutiny, decided that the narrow and contested result in the 2016 referendum had actually given her a clear mandate for a series of red lines about the future relationship between the EU and the UK. No more free movement of people, no more jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in relation to the UK, no more, as she called it, vast payments to the EU budget. Now, the logical and necessary implication of those red lines was that the UK was going to leave not just the EU, but also the customs union and the single market. It's worth pointing out that only the most extreme and marginal Leave campaigners had actually argued for that outcome during the referendum campaign itself. But this was the logical conclusion of the policies which Theresa May had unilaterally imposed. But leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, in other words, having a relatively distant future relationship with the EU, as we know, means serious disruption and very difficult problems for Northern Ireland. Yet for 2 years, the May government simply denied that these problems even existed. They claimed that the UK could take back control, but still have a special partnership with the EU in which the UK could retain many of the benefits of its former membership, but without having to suffer the corresponding obligations. Now, it should have been very clear that that strategy was never going to work because in essence, the UK was asking for better treatment, not just than any other third country on earth, but actually better treatment than the member states give themselves as member states of the European Union. So it was only really after the collapse of the so-called Chequers Plan in the summer of 2018 the May government finally had to make a choice, and they did make a choice. The May government did make a choice. In effect, Theresa May decided to postpone the rhetoric of taking back control and prioritized maintaining, at least to some degree, a closer relationship with the EU, minimizing disruption and finding an easier UK-wide solution to the problem of the Irish border, at least in the short and medium term. Now, let's be a little bit more precise about that. On its face, the political declaration on future relations between the UK and the EU that was agreed by the government of Theresa May did envisage only a relatively distant future EU-UK relationship. Because the British insisted on their red lines, they were going to leave the customs union in the single market, the union would see through the logical implications of that position when it came to only a limited degree and depth of cooperation with the UK as a third country. But in actual fact, the so-called Irish backstop, which was contained in Theresa May's version of the withdrawal agreement, meant that the UK was actually going to remain much more closely linked to the EU across a wider range of policy fields than what was suggested in the political declaration itself. Remember that the proposed Irish backstop of Theresa May set out an effective customs union between the EU and the UK, built almost entirely on the EU's terms, of course, with no possibility for the British to pursue an independent trade policy. The protocol also envisaged significant regulatory convergence between the Union and the UK across a wide range of policy fields, again, entirely on the EU's terms. And given that the UK needed the EU's consent in order to replace or terminate these arrangements, actually it was this Irish backstop that was going to provide the backbone for future relations between the EU and the UK for the foreseeable future, and probably for really quite some considerable period of time indeed. So Theresa May's approach to these negotiations, on its face, a distant relationship, option 2, but in practice, a much closer relationship, much closer to option 1. Now, the replacement of Theresa May with Boris Johnson radically changed the dynamics of this entire situation. As we all know, there is a more than reasonable suspicion that Boris Johnson assumed office intending simply to conduct a sham renegotiation exercise, blame the EU for its failure, and then leave at the earliest opportunity without any negotiated settlement at all. If that was indeed Johnson's plan, and I suspect that it was, Parliament effectively closed it off with the so-called Benn Act, which basically said you cannot leave without a deal. And that meant that Johnson was obliged to seek to the political declaration that had been previously finalized by Theresa May. But for these purposes, Johnson approached the whole task of renegotiation with a completely different set of priorities compared to his predecessor. For Johnson, taking back control demanded a genuinely distant future relationship between the EU and the UK, and that had to be put in place as soon as possible so that the UK could exercise its freedom, first of all, to diverge from EU standards, socioeconomic standards, and secondly, to embark upon the rather fantastical global Britain trade policy. Significant dislocation and disruption in existing relations with the EU in fields like trade and security, the legal and economic segregation of Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, these were simply the prices to be paid for realizing this objective, a genuinely distant relationship as soon as possible. So the political declaration was redrafted to dilute still further the ambition for future EU-UK relations, and the Irish backstop provisions were revised to ensure that Northern Ireland didn't stand in Johnson's way. Now, in particular, the revised political declaration, certainly when it comes to trade trade relations, basically boils down to an aspiration to have no tariffs and no quotas on trade and goods between the EU and the UK. But that's about it. Otherwise, there's only limited cooperation to minimize customs and frontier checks. There's only limited cooperation to address the major problem of international trade, which is the creation of regulatory barriers to commerce and goods. There's hardly anything on cross-border provision of services, even though that represents the vast majority of the UK economy. And there's almost nothing on the mobility of natural persons beyond, for example, reciprocal visa-free short stays for holiday and possibly certain business purposes. But even this limited aspiration of zero tariffs or quotas on trading goods meant that the EU still insisted upon, and the UK government accepted, important commitments to ensure a so-called level playing field in fields like competition law, state aid restrictions, employment rights, and environmental protection. And in addition, the two parties agreed that their future relationship depended on reaching a satisfactory agreement on the politically sensitive, though economically marginal question of fisheries, one in which continued access to British fishing waters by EU vessels would be directly linked to continued access by British suppliers to their primary European market. Now, that was basically the deal that was agreed in outline by Boris Johnson in October 2019. It wasn't intended to be a legally binding statement. It's not legally binding or enforceable. It was a good faith expression of the parties' common political understanding that would then provide the direct basis and framework for subsequent negotiations. But the negotiations themselves, of course, could depart from this understanding in various ways as talks unfolded. It was nevertheless the basis upon which the EU and the UK signed their withdrawal deal. It was the basis upon which Johnson fought and won the December 2019 general election, and it was the basis on which Parliament passed the legislation and the UK left the EU in January of this year. So I think we were all entitled to assume that it would indeed provide the basis for negotiations on future EU-UK relations. But of course, how naive we were to forget just what a dishonest and untrustworthy little man Boris Johnson actually is. Within just a few weeks, literally a few weeks of the UK's leaving the EU, Johnson publicly repudiated his own revised political declaration on future EU-UK relations, making it clear that the government didn't even regard itself as morally bound to keep its own word, and that even the already distant ties that were foreseen in the political declaration were no longer distant enough for these newly radicalized Tories in the government. Remember that the Tory party, as we know it now, is not the Tory party of previous years and generations. It's effectively a radicalized hard right movement aligned, cut from the same cloth as Donald Trump. Indeed, when negotiations finally commenced, many commentators really quickly concluded that the UK government wasn't making much of a serious effort to reach any meaningful agreement with the EU at all. The UK negotiators immediately revised their frankly now quite tedious Cake and Eat It Act, making completely unreasonable requests that for the UK to enjoy full tariff and quota-free access to the single market, but without having to undertake anything than minimal level playing field requirements so as to guarantee fair competition in return. But probably more importantly than that was Johnson's refusal even to consider extending the post-withdrawal status quo transition period that we're currently living under, but is going to expire very soon, as provided for under the withdrawal agreement. Remember that the UK itself had asked for a power to extend the transition period by an extra 12 or 24 months, just in case there wasn't enough time to conclude the negotiations to a satisfactory level, because we all wanted to avoid a sort of cliff edge Brexit in January of 2021, and then double regulatory changes or triple regulatory changes if an agreement or more agreements were to emerge in later years. And yet the Johnson government simply ruled out any possibility of an extension and then stuck to that position even after the onset of the pandemic, the global and national health and economic crisis caused by the coronavirus, thereby threatening the UK with a double catastrophe as from January of 2021. So on the one hand, the Johnson government was deliberately and systematically dismantling the agreement it had already reached with the EU about what the outlines of the future EU-UK relationship should look like. At exactly the same time, as we know, the UK government was also busy undermining its own revised Irish protocol to prevent the return of a hard border across the island of Ireland. Now, this started with the Prime Minister systematically lying about the protocol, both in Parliament and in public, claiming, for example, that there would be no checks or controls of any kind on trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and that any EU paperwork could be simply chucked in the bin. This is totally untrue. There's not even a shred, the tiniest shred of truth in what Boris Johnson was saying, but he repeated it frequently in both Parliament and in public. It continued, of course, with serious delays to publication of the UK's plans for full operational implementation of the Northern Irish trading plans. Even when those plans were eventually published, they were immediately criticised from all quarters for failing to provide proper details and a full workable operational solution to the key challenges. Even now, the EU is still asking the UK absolutely urgently to publish its precise plans for how to deal with trade to and from Northern Ireland. Businesses right across the country, and especially in Northern Ireland, are literally tearing their hair out because they don't know what rules they will need to follow and what processes they will need to undergo in only 4 weeks' time. And of course, let's not forget publication of the UK Internal Market Bill that Evelyn referred to in her introduction. This does contain blatant and explicit plans to legislate for a deliberate breach of the withdrawal agreement with the EU. The government, as we know, has also announced additional powers that it's due to publish next week that would simply tear a massive hole right through the withdrawal agreement's plans to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. As you're probably aware, these proposals have caused really serious upset across Europe and further afield. The Commission has already started the formal process of bringing the UK to the European Court of Justice under the withdrawal agreement for this clear breach of its legally binding obligations. And of course, the UK's reputation as a member of the rules-based international order has been seriously compromised, though more importantly, the UK is deliberately playing a game that could end up with the reintroduction of a hard border across the island of Ireland that would be a direct threat to peace and stability and render the UK, quite frankly, a danger to peace in Europe. And in any case, all of it is making the job of reaching an agreement on future EU-UK relations, let alone an agreement on future US-UK trade relations, any easier. There have been recent reports that government officials have effectively admitted that the UK Internal Market Bill and the upcoming Finance Bill clauses are only really intended as leverage in the current EU-UK negotiations. And if that's true, of course, it only makes Johnson look even grubbier than he does already. That's quite a feat, given that we're starting from a zero baseline already. The negotiations continue. There have been clearly some progress over the last couple of months. For example, the UK seems to have offered the EU satisfactory guarantees that it will continue to maintain basic human rights standards within the UK itself. Now, from the EU's perspective, this is a precondition for closer cooperation with any third country in fields like security and cross-border police cooperation and anti-terrorism cooperation. We might have assumed as citizens of this country that it would be a basic prerequisite for even being considered a civilized society that the government agrees to treat its own population in accordance with fundamental principles of law. But apparently we need the EU to force the Johnson government to make that type of commitments on our behalf. Be that as it may, some key substantive points of divergence between the EU and the UK do remain, and they seem to have been pretty much the same. Obviously, we don't know the details yet, but the issues haven't really changed, really, since March. First of all, we have questions about the basic structure and governance of any agreement. And the focus here seems to be on adequate dispute settlement and enforcement provisions. And in particular, the EU is concerned that there should be an effective system of sanctions against the UK if it breaches its terms of the agreement. Obviously, that concern has been made much more pressing on the Union's part by the Boris Johnson plans in relation to the Irish Border Protocol, but the UK seems to be resisting this particular demand. Secondly, we have the detail of the level playing field guarantees that are required to prevent unfair competition in fields like state aid, labour standards, environmental standards, and so on. Again, the UK apparently continuing to push back against EU demands that the UK has to give effective and adequate guarantees, both of standards and enforcement. And then finally, as we all know, because it's in the news nearly every day, rules on access to fishing waters and fishing markets. An issue whose political importance, certainly in the UK, is out of all rational proportion to its relative economic significance. Now, these are the various specific areas where substantive disagreement emerged and remains between the EU and the UK positions. But I think more fundamentally, if we set aside the detail, more fundamentally, I think there is an important difference in assumption and perspective between the two parties, which explains why these negotiations have been so, in many respects, so antagonistic and so unpleasant. Most parties, by the way, when they're actually trying to reach an agreement with each other, are doing it because they really want to, and they're doing it as friends and allies in a respectful and courteous way. The difference with the UK-EU negotiations could not be more different, where we basically just hear on an almost daily basis hostility and antagonism and threats, and it's really, really all very unpleasant. On the UK side, the Boris Johnson government has made it clear that it simply places no particular emphasis or importance on its future relations with the EU. For the Johnson government, the EU is just one out of hundreds of international actors that global Britain will have to deal with into the future. And actually, far from it, the UK wants an extreme form of clean break Brexit, far more extreme than really anybody seriously contemplated or advocated at the time of the 2016 referendum. And yet the UK repeatedly insists that it's the sovereign equal of the EU. Now, this is a very odd claim to lawyers' ears, especially given the fact that the EU is not actually a sovereign entity at all, because it's not a state, it's not a federation, it's a collection of sovereign member states themselves, but the EU is not a sovereign entity. We probably can guess that the UK is trying to make some political rather than legal or constitutional point here, but even politically, it's painfully obvious that the UK is not the equal of the 27 sovereign states of the EU, not in terms of population, not in terms of economy, not in terms of influence, not in terms of global and strategic significance. They're simply not equal. So what the UK really seems to mean when it complains about being the sovereign equal of the EU is that the EU itself is simply refusing to offer the UK privileges that the British seem to think that they're entitled to as a matter of right, merely by virtue of their own existence. What the UK government seems to have done is simply go through the various existing trade agreements that the EU has signed with a wide variety of countries over a significant period of time in a whole range of contexts, and said, we want that bit, and we want that bit, and we want that bit too. Basically just picking little bits of agreements at its own convenience and saying, why can't we have these special privileges too? To be frank, it's an attitude and an approach which is so infantile that it makes my skin crawl. But anyway, that is exactly the approach that His Royal Holiness David Frost seems to have adopted in these negotiations. Now, for its part, the EU has very little time, of course, for the UK's claims and complaints. The EU agrees each party is indeed sovereign, as it were, over its own territory, and the point of that sovereignty, as it were, is to determine the conditions upon which other people access our market. That's the whole point of having negotiations in the first place. But existing relationships between the EU and anyone else in the world don't create some form of binding precedent. They don't act as some form of legitimate expectation. The EU and the UK simply have to negotiate an agreement tailored to their particular circumstances and needs, using their respective interests and bargaining power as the primary reference point. And in reality, says the EU, it's the UK which is making unreasonable demands and seriously failing to engage with important points of these negotiations. So really the EU has more or less forgotten the resentment of the UK simply ripping up the old political declaration. The more fundamental problem here is Boris Johnson's belief that British exceptionalism it should allow the UK selectively to maintain the benefits of being a member of the EU, but without having to comply with the corresponding obligations. And I think it's that fundamental difference in self-perception and perspective, rather than the individual different negotiating problems which have arisen, that really explain why the current process has been so painful. But we'll see over the next few days whether attitudes change, positions shift, and anything worth ratifying emerges from these talks. So I'll summarize and then offer a few conclusions. It was the UK that decided to lay down various red lines during the months after the 2016 referendum without any serious debate or scrutiny, and the inevitable implication of those red lines was to rule out any close relationship with the EU into the future. Indeed, the logical consequence of the UK's demands to take back control were a serious dislocation in existing relations with the EU and the need to find a workable solution to the problem of a hard border across the island of Ireland. Those were inevitable consequences of the Theresa May government's positioning. For a long period of time, the May government tried to deny and escape the logic of its own choices. And it's fair to say, I'll give Boris Johnson one tiny bit of credit, the Johnson government has at least reformulated the UK position on future relations with the EU in a way which at least is a little more honest and internally coherent in its own terms than that of Theresa May. But that's the only good thing I will ever say about Boris Johnson in my entire life. The cost of this clarity is that the Johnson government is now driving the UK headlong towards a serious rupture in its relationship with the EU. And crucially, that will be true regardless of whether there is a deal or whether there is no deal at all. Even within the relatively narrow confines of the future relationship, which is currently being contemplated by both of the parties, the EU continues to chide the UK for its cake and eat it philosophy, the idea that the UK should continue to enjoy benefits without having obligations. But even in the most optimistic scenario, and here we are talking about the most optimistic scenario, if a deal is done on terms that are acceptable to both parties in time to enter into force in just a few weeks' time, it will involve such a transformation and downgrading in EU-UK relations that for many sectors, for many actors, there may as well be no deal at all. That's not to deny the value, of course, in having some sort of deal. It's a good thing not to have lots of extra tariffs that will only increase costs for us as consumers and make UK businesses less competitive. Of course, that's just an idly damaging thing to not have an agreement on that. But we shouldn't pretend that the Johnson deal is suddenly going to magic away border controls. It's suddenly going to offer a solution to market partitioning through regulatory divergence. It's going to do anything to help the service sector or undo the loss of EU citizenship and free movement rights for 65 million people. This deal will do none of those things, and it will not do many other things as well. But that's the most optimistic scenario. It seems just as likely that negotiating time will run out, the transition period will expire, there'll be no significant or comprehensive agreement in place, and in that case, the hard nut job Brexiteers will get the hard nut job Brexit, which they really, really wanted. And even then, if a deal does emerge later down the line in a year or 2 years' time, it will only mean the 2 or 3 regulatory changes that the entire transition period, the entire possibility of extension were precisely designed to avoid because everybody agreed it was so damaging and undesirable. And whatever happens, whichever of these scenarios emerges, major changes will take place in the middle of an ongoing pandemic. A deliberate decision by the Johnson government to pile one major crisis on top of another simply through their ideological refusal to extend the transition period. Now, what should we make of all of that? Those are all simple statements of reality. What should we make of it all? There's an obvious and a striking contradiction between Boris Johnson's proud idea of global Britain as the champion of free trade across the world versus the reality that the UK government is poised to commit the single gravest act of economic segregation ever committed in modern human history. Even besides the damage that will inevitably flow from the UK's decision deliberately to dislocate and distance itself from the EU, that choice also has various important internal consequences as well. For example, the customs tensions that will affect and damage Northern Ireland only grow in proportion to the degree of Britain's divergence from the EU itself. And the same is actually true for Scotland and for Wales as the UK internal market legislation is put in place and the whole system of internal trade within the UK becomes subject to very difficult economic and political tensions as well, in proportion to the degree of divergence of the UK as a whole from the EU. But most of all, we have to wonder why the Johnson government appears so fixated on the power to diverge from EU regulatory standards. After all, many of these standards are only minimum in nature, and they've never prevented the UK from having higher levels of public protection if that's what the UK wants. So why do we need this power of divergence? Maybe taking back control really is just a shallow exercise in nationalistic political rhetoric, or maybe the Tories really do intend to harbour and implement their dreams of dismantling the UK's adherence to the EU's distinctive socio-economic model. The UK's increasingly abrasive approach to the future relationship, of course, also poses serious challenges to the EU itself. And I suspect that as pro-European citizens, many of the people in this Zoom event should be equally concerned about the future of the EU as they are about the future of the UK, because this is our common civilization that we're worried about and interested in. I'm very, very lucky in my job. I work with colleagues right across Europe in law, in research, in government, and the verdict I hear on a weekly basis is both unanimous and damning. It's hard to believe that such a fundamentally important set of relationships as those between the UK and its closest neighbours, partners, friends and allies in Europe have been so seriously and deliberately mismanaged and damaged by this toxic combination of ideology and incompetence. And this is the type of damage that can take years, if not a generation, to properly repair. And in the meantime, the EU itself has to prepare for the genuine risk. It's a genuine risk that there'll be an aggressive competitor right on its own doorstep, actively undertaking market deregulation and encouraging social dumping as an alternative economic model, while constantly engaging in attempts to undermine the political unity and solidarity of the member states themselves. Even looking beyond the current generation of Tory politicians in office, and believe me, I spend a lot of my life trying to look beyond the current generation of Tory politicians, the further and the harder that the UK drifts away from the European mainstream, the more difficult it will be for future administrations to bring it back again and to repair that damage. But in the meantime, we have to really firmly locate the debate on future EU-UK relations within the wider geopolitical landscape, which is currently affecting the whole of the developed world. Because on the one hand, the UK Tories are fully paid up converts to the cause of international hard-right populism. And on the other hand, the EU and its friends and its allies are effectively acting in existential defense of the basic values of liberal social market democracy that we have lived with for many decades, in fact, probably since 1945. Now, the very good news for the EU and its friends is that with Joe Biden's election, one of the main proponents of hard-right post-truth populism will soon be eliminated from the world scene. And we can return to a greater degree of normality as the US attempts to rebuild positive relations with the EU and other responsible supporters of the rule-based international order. Conversely, I hope that it's a real worry for the Tory hard right that their main international ally and supporter, upon whom so many of their most vivid dreams and nightmares depended, will soon be out of office. Trump's elimination is a wonderful news in and of itself, of course it is, but it's also good news for us as well. The problem is that the risk for us is that delinquent Britain, not global Britain, delinquent Britain will soon look rather sadly exposed on the world stage. And we have another several years of these, frankly, really quite deranged people in power, still capable of doing a hell of a lot more damage than they've done already. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.